The laughter of the elite. In the autumn of 1944, deep within the damp, frozen forests of the Ardennes, a group of captured German officers stood in a clearing surrounded by soldiers of the U.S. 101st Airborne. The Germans were elite, members of the Fallschirmjäger, and they prided themselves on their equipment. They carried the MP-40, a masterpiece of German engineering, finished with machined steel and bakelite grips. It was a weapon of prestige. One of the German officers gestured toward the weapon slung over an American paratrooper's shoulder. He began to chuckle, a dry, mocking sound. He pointed at the crude, stamped metal frame, the wire stock that looked like it belonged on a bird cage, and the roughly welded seams. To the German, it didn't look like a weapon of war. It looked like a piece of cheap plumbing, a mechanic's grease gun. "Is this what the great American industry produces?" the officer asked in broken English. "A toy made of tin?" The American paratrooper didn't argue. He didn't have to. He knew something the German didn't. He knew that in the mud of the Bastogne trenches, where the elegant MP-40s were jamming because their tight tolerances couldn't handle the grit, this piece of plumbing was still spitting out heavy .45 caliber slugs. The German saw an ugly tool. The American saw a survivor. This is the story of the M3 grease gun, the weapon Hitler's generals laughed at, but eventually came to fear. This is the story of how a $15 piece of sheet metal defeated the pride of the Third Reich. The ghost of the Thompson. To understand the M3, we first have to understand the weapon it was meant to replace, the legendary M1928 Thompson. The Tommy gun was an icon. It was the weapon of Prohibition-era gangsters and the Chicago typewriter. When the U.S. entered World War II, every soldier wanted one. It was beautiful, it was fast, and it was deadly. But the Thompson had a fatal flaw for a global war. It was an aristocrat in a world that needed laborers. Each Thompson cost the U.S. government roughly $225 to produce, nearly $4,000 in today's money. It required hours of precision machining. It was heavy, weighing over 10 pounds empty. By 1942, as the U.S. prepared to equip millions of men, the Ordnance Department realized they couldn't build Thompsons fast enough or cheap enough. They needed a Sten for America. The British had already shown the way with the Sten gun, a weapon so simple it could be built in a bicycle shop. The Americans looked at the German MP-40 and the British Sten and realized the era of the handcrafted gun was over. The era of the disposable gun had begun. Born in a lamp factory. In late 1942, the U.S. Army turned to a man named George Hyde and the engineers at General Motors' Guide Lamp Division. Think about that for a moment. The most important new submachine gun of the war wasn't designed by a traditional arms manufacturer like Colt or Remington. It was designed by people who spent their days stamping out metal housings for car headlights. The Guide Lamp Division understood mass production better than anyone. They didn't see a gun. They saw a series of metal stampings that could be welded together. The receiver of the M3 was literally two halves of sheet steel pressed into shape and fused together. The barrel was a simple tube. The stock was a piece of bent heavy-gauge wire. When the first prototypes, designated the T-20, were tested, the brass was horrified by its appearance. It was oily, dark, and looked like a tool found in a garage. Soldiers immediately dubbed it the grease gun. But then they pulled the trigger. The grease gun fired the .45 ACP round, the same massive bullet used by the Colt 1911 and the Thompson. But while the Thompson roared at 800 rounds per minute, the M3 chugged along at a slow, rhythmic 450 rounds per minute. Thump, 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 thump. This slow rate of fire was its secret genius. A soldier could hold the trigger down and the gun wouldn't climb toward the sky. It was incredibly easy to control. A raw recruit could be trained to hit targets with an M3 in half the time it took to master a Thompson.
Even more importantly, the M3 cost only $15 to make. You could build 15 grease guns for the price of one Thompson. The plumbing goes to war. The M3 made its combat debut during the Normandy invasion in June 1944. It was issued to paratroopers, tank crews, and truck drivers. Initially, the reception was cold. GIs who had grown up watching gangster movies wanted the sleek Thompson. They looked at the M3 with suspicion. But the reality of the front line changes opinions quickly. In the hedgerows of France, soldiers discovered that the M3 was a tank. You could drop it in the mud, pick it up, and it would fire. You could neglect to clean it for days in the rain, and it would fire. Its internal parts were loose by design, leaving plenty of room for dirt and grit to move around without jamming the bolt. The Germans, meanwhile, were beginning to notice a change. Their own MP-40 was a fine weapon, but it fired the 9mm Parabellum, a fast, light round. The American M3 was hitting them with the .45 ACP, a mass stopper that carried twice the weight. In close-quarters house clearing, a single hit from a grease gun was often enough to end a fight instantly. The M3A1, evolution of a killer. Even a disposable gun has room for improvement. The original M3 had a complicated crank handle cocking mechanism that was prone to breaking. If that handle snapped off, the gun was a paperweight. The Army's solution was brilliantly simple. In the upgraded M3A1, they removed the handle entirely. How did the soldier cock the gun? They cut a hole in the bolt. The soldier simply stuck his finger in the hole and pulled the bolt back. It was crude, it was ugly, and it was perfect. It meant there were fewer moving parts to break. They also added a larger ejection port cover that doubled as a safety. If the cover was closed, the gun couldn't fire. If it was open, you were ready for business. The logistics of victory. This is where Hitler's generals truly missed the mark. German military philosophy was built on quality over quantity. They built the Tiger tank and the MP-40, masterpieces that were hard to maintain and impossible to replace. American philosophy, embodied by the M3, was quantity is its own quality. The U.S. produced over 600,000 grease guns during the war. They didn't bother making spare parts for them. If an M3 broke, the soldier was told simply to throw it away and grab a new one. This was a level of industrial might the Axis couldn't even imagine. While a German armorer spent hours hand-fitting a firing pin into an MP-40, General Motors was stamping out 1,000 grease guns before lunch. Beyond the Reich. The M3 didn't die when the war ended. While the elegant weapons of World War II were retired to museums, the grease gun kept working. It saw heavy action in the frozen hills of Korea, where its simple mechanism was one of the few that wouldn't freeze shut in the sub-zero temperatures. It served in the jungles of Vietnam, carried by helicopter pilots and special forces who needed a compact, hard-hitting backup. Perhaps the most shocking fact is that the M3 remained in the official U.S. inventory until the 1990s. During Operation Desert Storm, M1 Abrams tank crews were still issued the M3A1 as a personal defense weapon. Why? Because even 50 years later, no one had built a submachine gun that was as small, as reliable, and as hard-hitting as that $15 piece of plumbing. The beauty of the beast. Today, the M3 grease gun stands as a symbol of the arsenal of democracy. It wasn't pretty. It didn't have the cool factor of the Thompson or the precision of the MP-40, but it was exactly what was needed to win a world war. A simple, cheap, unstoppable tool that did its job without complaint. The German officers who laughed at the M3 in the woods of the Ardennes eventually learned a hard lesson. Wars aren't won by the most beautiful weapons. They're won by the weapons that keep firing when the world turns to mud. The grease gun was the ultimate survivor.